Welcome, everybody. My name is David Hart. I'm the director of the Mitchell Center. So it's my pleasure to introduce Aaron Strong. He's a new assistant professor in marine policy in the School of Marine Sciences. He had to go off and leave Maine for a while to find his way back. He grew up in Lewiston. Has an undergraduate degree from Swarthmore College, and this is, I think, one indication of those crossroads I was talking about, biology and political science. I actually had the pleasure of teaching and doing research at Swarthmore for a number of years, and what I hated about, and I'm sure Aaron was one of these students, what I hated about them is they were so dang smart that, like, when I published papers with them, they were the first authors, and I was way down at the end of the author list. He found his way to the West Coast at Stanford, where he completed quite recently his PhD in the interdisciplinary program in environment and resources. And again, speaking of the Mitchell lecture, not too many years ago, Pam Matson was here from Stanford, who helps to lead a lot of sustainability efforts at Stanford. We hope to benefit a lot. I think that Aaron is a perfect example of not just the kind of talent that has emerged right in our midst from many great students that have gotten degrees here, but now it looks like we're beginning to attract folks from only technically away, since he found his way home, but that are really adding to our capacity, and this is very exciting as someone who's been watching this for a while. I will say, if you want to know more about his personal story, our communications and outreach coordinator in the back, David Sims, has just written a wonderful story about Aaron called Coming Home that you can find on our website. So I'm not going to say much more about his talk. I think it'll speak for itself, literally and figuratively. But the title is, Does the Value of Nature Depend on Whom You Ask, and Should It? Welcome, Aaron.
So thanks so much, David, for that wonderful introduction. And if you go read that piece by David Sims, Coming Home, there's a little pull-out quote that says, the presence of the Mitchell Center on campus was one of the main reasons that I chose to come to the University of Maine. And they didn't ask me to say that. It really is true. I want to work in this kind of collaborative space and environment on these kind of thorny problems. And so I'm really excited to be here, and thanks again to David for inviting me to give this talk to all of you today. So, does the value of nature depend upon whom we ask, and should it? I'm going to break my talk into two parts today. And first, I'm going to talk a little bit about the challenge of ecosystem services as an Anthropocene solution. And this is really a call to action for sustainability scientists to get involved in what's going on right now in the realm of ecosystem services in this country. And in the second part, I'll discuss what I think of as an illustrative study of how the tools of sustainability scientists can help inform what's going on. And this is a paper that's currently in revision at Ecology and Society, Barriers to Incorporating Climate Change Mitigation Ecosystem Services into Coastal Conservation Practice. Focuses on blue carbon. So, welcome to the Anthropocene. We're here. We know it. Human beings are fundamentally altering Earth system functions. We can graph it, and it's not hard to graph, and you don't need to see the labels on those graphs. Everything goes up, right? This is what's called the Great Acceleration. And the Anthropocene has caused a lot of problems. We have found through extensive research that currently human activities are pushing Earth system functioning past several what are called planetary boundaries. And this is a big push and thrust of sustainability scientists to try to understand where are the tipping points in Earth system functioning. And my first experience in the Mitchell Center was actually being the disembodied voice in the ceiling when I called in. So I'm excited that I am, again, the disembodied voice in the ceiling. So in terms of our effects on the carbon cycle, our effects on the nitrogen cycle, and our effects on biodiversity loss, in each one of these arenas, human activities and human actions, whether it's climate change, ocean acidification, eutrophication, or species extinction, have really changed how the world works. And this is part of what motivates so many students like myself when I was a PhD student, and students like many of you, to study sustainability problems. We see this going around us right now, right? And so, what are we doing about these problems, right? So what are the responses to the problems of the Anthropocene? Well, I'd like to posit that right now we're going through a transition in decision-making towards environmental stewardship, and that this transition involves and invokes a tremendous amount of accounting of human impacts on the environment and valuation of nature. So if we think about decision making in the Anthropocene, whether it's greenhouse gas offsets under cap and trade programs, sustainability accounting, carbon neutrality, nutrient trading, biodiversity offsets, we're developing right now a series of new institutions that are changing some of the relationship between human societies and the ecosystems that we're seeking to manage in response to the Anthropocene. And front and center in this sort of transition in environmental governance that we can see going on all around us has been the development of the ecosystem services framework. So ecosystem services are the values that functioning ecosystems, natural and working lands, and marine and coastal systems provide to human societies. And they're real values. I can't emphasize that enough. That they're true economic values. They're sometimes really hard to know, and most of them are currently not internalized into our markets. That is, in our exchange of goods and services, those values are lost. They're externalized. Whether they're positive or negative externalities, they're not incorporated. And so the idea of ecosystem services is that if we can include the values that nature gives us into our decision-making frameworks, into our markets, then we can better and more accurately reflect all of the negative externalities of the damages and harms of the Anthropocene. Right? This is the idea of ecosystem services. And so, famously in the mid-1990s, Robert Costanza and a lot of the ecological economics group at UVM calculated the value of global natural capital to be about $33 trillion. That's since been raised up. And traditionally, we divide ecosystem services into several different kinds: provisioning services, regulating services, supporting services, and cultural ecosystem services. Now, provisioning services tend to be commodities that we're more comfortable with thinking about as commodities that values are placed upon, that dollar values are placed upon. Agricultural products, for example. And cultural ecosystem services are at the other end of the spectrum, and they tend to be services that we're a little less comfortable, by and large, putting a dollar value onto. Spiritual experiences, for example. Certainly tourism and recreational experiences are easier to get at in terms of valuation. And the ecosystem service framework as a framework has expanded rapidly. So this is a graph from Google Ngram showing the rise in the usage of the term throughout the 1990s and really taking off over the last 15 years, right? And this has led to calls for this framework to migrate from where it started, which was in the academic and NGO literature as an idea for how to kind of get at the value of nature and incorporate it into decision-making for the purposes of conservation, by and large, into implementation. And so this is a 2008 paper by Gretchen Daly and Pam Matson, both of whom are sort of key figures in the world of sustainability science, and I know Pam has spoken here, and these were the two of the handful of people that created the program I went to at Stanford for my dissertation. But we've begun exploring how do we go from the theory of ecosystem service valuation towards implementation, right? How do we go from doing these valuations in scientific and economic papers where we use approaches from contingent valuation to replacement cost methods, hedonic pricing, travel cost methods, just this traditional way of approaching economic valuation of nature, into actually implementing this in decision-making practice in the real world, right? And so my news flash for all of you today is right now we're doing that. Extra ecosystem services to be considered in federal regulatory context by all agencies. The White House issued a memo less than a year ago directing all federal agencies to begin to develop and promote the consideration of ecosystem services where appropriate and practical in planning, investments, and regulatory contexts. This is a big deal. The federal government, the Obama administration, has recognized that it's really important to value green infrastructure and ecosystem services into decision-making. And so they've directed agencies to figure out how to do that, right? How do we actually consider all of these values in the day-to-day decisions that are taking place in regulatory context by all of the agencies that many of us in this room work with, whether it's the Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA NIMS or the EPA, you name it, right? And as you can imagine, there's a lot of discussion about how to do this, right? And so these are really exciting times for ecosystem services, and we're getting valuations taking place that are much closer to in the involvement of stakeholders all over the place, including in Maine, right? And so what I'd like to pose to you all is the question of how should we do it when we're doing it for real? How should we do it when we're actually trying to inform agency decision making? And how do we do it all? And it's really not easy to think about, because if you think about a salt marsh, for example, like this one, and you're trying to get at all of the ecosystem services that this salt marsh provides, whether it's carbon storage, which is what they're looking at right here, or habitat for migratory birds, or flood protection, or recreation value, or spiritual value, the list adds up really quickly. And to make matters really complicated, I want to introduce you to the subject, or the topic of service sheds. So if we think about ecosystem services from an ecosystem like this marsh, they're delivered at multiple scales, right? So service sheds are the geographic area in which the services from another geographic area are delivered, right? So if we think about having a functioning farm that has habitat for migratory birds, some of that habitat value can extend beyond the edge of the farm. If we think about the value of fish stocked in a lake, there's a certain distance that people will travel to go to a particular lake to visit and extract those fish, which are one of the provisioning ecosystem services from that lake. So in addition to the complexities of actually doing the economic valuation with a variety of tools of economics, there's a real challenge of scale here. And we're used to seeing these lists of ecosystem services provided by a given ecosystem. So this picture, which was the cover picture for my talk, is right next to the chops at Merry Meeting Bay. I don't know if any of you have been to Merry Meeting Bay, where it's where it drains out. So I was on a little rafting trip when we rested before going through here. And if you look at this picture, this ecosystem here in Merry Meeting Bay with its fringing marshes and its tidal exchange has nutrient removal ecosystem services, property value ecosystem services, wildlife habitat, fish habitat for both endangered species and commercial and recreational fish species. It provides water quality downstream for clams. It has implications for energy infrastructure development, flood mitigation, recreational opportunities, and carbon sequestration. The service shed of Merry Meeting Bay goes from the scale of a few meters in terms of the property value that it provides to the entire planet. Every single person on this planet benefits from the carbon sequestration value of these marshes, right? And that means that the stakeholder communities that have a stake in the management of these ecosystem services range from a handful of rather wealthy folks from away who own houses on the tip there in Bath to every single person in the world. That is a real big challenge when we think about it in terms of management. And furthermore, this directive is to federal agencies, each of the existing federal agencies to do this, which means if each federal agency, when making a decision about managing this geography, has to consider all of these and their service sheds and stakeholders, that means the Fish and Wildlife Service has to do it, EPA has to do it, the Department of Transportation has to do it, NOAA has to do it, Department of Energy has to do it, everyone has to do it. This is a really big deal. And I have another paper that I'm not going to talk about today that assesses the current practice and treatment of ecosystem services by each one of these agencies. And if you'd like to come talk to me about it afterwards, I'd love to chat about it. But the tops of the list is actually the Fish and Wildlife Service. They're doing a better job, a more comprehensive job than any of the other agencies right now in terms of doing this. But okay, so what are the agencies doing? How are they thinking about this right now? We've sort of seen these traditional academic methods for getting at the value of ecosystem services. But what are the agencies doing? So this document was released in late 2015, and it represents the synthesis of some of the current thinking by folks who are working directly with the agencies. It's a group out of Duke that's focused on developing best management practices for integrating ecosystem services into federal decision making. And their big recommendation is, if we think about this pathway where we have the ecosystem, which is in a geography that produces ecosystem services, we measure the ecosystem state through ecological indicators. We think about the ecosystem service supply, and then we think about the societal benefit. This is what we've traditionally gone after, measured by preference evaluation through economic means, right? Trying to get at what people's true values are, what their utility functions are associated with the management of the ecosystem, and use that to somehow inform policy. But the recommendations for best management practices are that doing this in all cases for everything is rather impractical and takes a whole lot of work. So if we can develop a new set of indicators called BRIs, benefit relevant indicators, that represent this flow from the ecosystem to the societal benefit, and use these indicators to make actions and policies, we will be able to engage in ecosystem service valuation of a sort that's actually implementable for an agency to make decisions. This is the proposal. This is what's on the table. This is what agencies are looking at and thinking about right now, right? And another way to think about that is in terms of the amount of time and resources that it takes and the capture of the ES benefit. There's kind of a continuum here. And their argument is that benefit relevant indicators, the use of BRIs, is sufficient to capture the ES benefit. It's not preferable to doing a complete and full quantitative preference evaluation, but it's sufficient. And so you get these spaghetti diagrams that look like this, and I realize this is hard to see. Their PDF of this report is actually really fuzzy when you download it from their website, so my apologies. But the idea here is that moving from ecological observations through ecosystem services towards the societal benefit, that this red space represents the benefit relevant indicators that we can use. So we now measure wildfire, fire frequency, fire intensity, for example, or habitat for species of interest. But what we want to get at are what are the indicators for populations of species that are of interest to people, where is access to wildlife where species live, access to game or fish, what about people's exposure to wildfire? And so we don't necessarily have to go all the way to property damage or health impacts if we can actually get at these intermediate variables. This is the idea, this is the theory. And they do this with a whole lot of spatial mapping and the usage of comparative scenarios, so you can look at the relative recreation, fisheries, and coastal protection value of different coastal ecosystems, for example, and use this as kind of an optimization function, right, in terms of assessing trade-offs between ecosystem services. This is the state of play. This is what our agencies are looking to do right now. So my question when I came into this and saw all of this was, where are the stakeholders in this process? And where is the process in this process? Are we really saying that the agency just sits there in a room and says, where's all the data that I can get? And yeah, okay, we're going to come up with some benefit relevant indicators. And so the best management practices are, to be perfectly blunt, a little bit light on this. And they do refer to the importance of stakeholder identification in several instances. And they say that this can be best done by first identifying the benefit relevant indicators, which will naturally point you to specific stakeholders, and by doing a bunch of service shed mapping, where you can actually look at the delivery of those services and then figure out who you should or shouldn't be talking to. And the fundamental idea here is that we're getting at societal values through a new set of indicators, rather than actually doing the work to do the societal preference evaluation or to involve stakeholders in this process evaluation. And I thought about this for a long time. I said, this is making me uncomfortable, and I couldn't figure out why. And I realized that this is the best way to represent that. So the entire idea behind this approach is that you do the valuation, and then you use that valuation and you give it to the to stakeholders in a decision-making process, and they can use that valuation in helping to make their decision and provide their input. But it seems to me that the value of nature depends quite strongly on the input of stakeholders in the first place. And if you're not going out and engaging with the communities that are actually using the resources, the public goods and common pool resources that are represented by ecosystem services, then this is an incredibly top-down process where the government says, here's the value, here's the true known value, our best guess, now use that to help make a decision. Feed it into a process that has stakeholder engagement, rather than starting in a process that has stakeholder engagement. So this is the concern, and this is the call to action for sustainability scientists who are potentially interested in working in this space. And it's a big space, and there are a lot of ecosystem services out there, and it's coming. You hear the chatter. And that's that there's a really, and Brady, you get your picture up here again. There's a really key role for sustainability scientists in here, because as we are building these new institutions, we need to spend a lot of time thinking about decision-making processes, stakeholder engagement, participation, scale and boundary spanning, and I already kind of emphasized the scale issue, knowledge to action, all the things that people talk about here in the Mitchell Center and talk about needing to be a part of sustainability solutions. I think there's a tremendous amount of room for baking those into the institutional approaches of agencies right now, because they haven't finalized these rules. This is the current set of best management practices. And it comes from a belief that there is a true value out there of the ecosystem services, right? And that we do whatever we can to know that value, with the data that we have, and then we present that and use that value. And that's the model. That's the top-down model. When in reality, if we think about the definition of ecosystem services as representing the values derived by human societies from a given ecosystem, there needs to be some role for input from the people using those resources in that valuation process. Not just because it would give you a better valuation, but because it fundamentally fits with everything that we know about what makes effective environmental governance. And that's where I'm steering this conversation to next as I discuss my illustrative case study. So I'm going to jump right into this, and this will be a presentation of my own research. So the first part was call to action, pay attention to what's going on in this ecosystem services space, because it's really interesting right now. And if you're interested in any of those subjects, I'd love to work with you as I build my research program here. So going back to our new and emergent institutions, right? They're being built all over the place. We see a lot of new ideas coming out in Anthropocene governance. And we have these new best practices for integrating ecosystem services into decision making. So how do we think about this from a theoretical framework, right? How do we assess what's going on? Well, fortunately, there's a social ecological systems framework that we can potentially apply to analyze these institutions and assess these institutions. So this is a framework built empirically over time, started with Eleanor Ostrom and many, many others who have come after her and worked on and expanded and refined it. But in essence, it breaks down a social ecological system into 4 components that meet in action situations. Resource units, resource systems. Resource units are part of resource systems that set conditions for action situations. Actors participate in these situations and are operating under a set of rules created by governance systems. And this is really designed for an assessment of common pool resource management institutions. So ecosystem services, and this is a caveat I'll throw out there, some of them are common pool resources. Some of them are public goods. So they're not necessarily rival in consumption. But the expansion of Ostrom's framework to considerations beyond scale and of public goods is a ripe area of scholarship in SES scholarship. And there are actually a series of papers coming out now thinking about ecosystem services using this framework. But this framework allows us to ask the question, how well does our empirical understanding of environmental governance that we've developed from these previous assessments of institutions apply to these newly emergent institutions in the Anthropocene, the ones that are trying to do this ecosystem service valuation? Right? Do they apply? And if so, in what ways? Like, do our design principles for what makes effective environmental governance institutions apply to ecosystem services and as a form of resource? This, I think, is a cautionary tale because one of the things we learn from all of Ostrom's work is that some element of stakeholder buy-in or some bottom-up processes are really important for enduring environmental governance institutions. You need to have some buy-in. And right now, there's not a lot of buy-in that I see. So that concern motivated the research I did on buy-in into the blue carbon ecosystem services framework, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about right now. So this paper is Barriers to Incorporating Climate Change Mitigation Ecosystem Services into Coastal Conservation Practice, the case of blue carbon. So what is blue carbon? Blue carbon is the carbon stored and sequestered in coastal ecosystems, tidal flats, salt marshes, mangroves, seagrass meadows. These ecosystems are incredibly productive and incredibly efficient carbon sinks per unit area. So globally, they sequester hundreds of millions of tons of carbon per year, about the equivalent to the emissions of the state of California. Now, they're not big in area. They're not like forests in terms of their overall area, but per unit area, these are incredibly powerful carbon sinks. They're also in ecosystems that either have been degraded and destroyed or in many parts of the world are actively being degraded and destroyed, that produce a tremendous number of other ecosystem services, from fish nursery habitat to recreational values to flood protection. Right? So blue carbon ecosystems from an ecosystem service perspective are pretty important. And if we return to our framework, in this paper, I'm really looking at the relationship between the resource units, the carbon sequestered, the governance system in terms of ecosystem services into decision making, and actors. And in this case, the actors I'm interested in are coastal conservation organizations, organizations that steward coastal lands like salt marshes and make decisions about how to manage them. So my research questions were, under what conditions do place-based coastal conservation organizations incorporate carbon sequestration ecosystem services into their work, if at all? And what barriers exist to such incorporation? In other words, as we're building institutions around ecosystem services right now in this country, it behooves us to take a look at how the organizations that are managing at the local scale these ecosystems are thinking about and interacting with the ecosystem services framework as stakeholders in those services. That's the motivation for the research. So my method was a series of semi-structured interviews. I first identified the study space, which is both the coast of California bioregion and the Gulf of Maine ecoregion. I then identified and contacted organizations, and each organization had to be involved in the stewardship of a bay or estuary or marsh ecosystem, which had a bunch of geographic parameters that I defined. And then I literally went up the coast and identified every single one of these organizations I could identify and contacted them. My response rate from Maine was much higher than my response rate from California, but I think it helped to say I was from Maine a lot. So I conducted 34 semi-structured interviews with organizational directors from each of these, and then used in vivo to code my interview transcripts, and my goal was to generate a typology of barriers and sets of conditions under which action on blue carbon, action on ecosystem services was taken. So I'm going to walk through this and present to you first the typology of barriers and then the facilitating conditions, and then discuss a kind of nuanced case that really gets at some issues of scale, and then I'll conclude. All right, my disembodied voice is no longer in the ceiling, which is making me really happy. All right, so the kinds of barriers that we saw. First and foremost were technical barriers. And so in each one of these, I'll provide from the data an illustrative quotation that really that was coded to this barrier to show you what I mean. So we decided to do a study, but we didn't have any intention of looking at the gas fluxes. I mean, I was like, are you kidding me with this stuff? So maybe the complexity of the gas fluxes are, along the lines of why no one's really trying to do blue carbon. Resources. We're barely able to do what we've already got going on, so we haven't really thought about it. We haven't had time to think about it, to be honest. And anything having to do with climate change mitigation ecosystem services will have this one. Political. I wouldn't touch carbon with a 10-foot pole. The literature on the kinds of barriers to innovative actions amongst coastal conservation organizations in general, land trusts, shows all of these things very robustly. And it's kind of one of those moments when you're doing social science and you're like, duh, right? Like, people don't have time or money, it's political, and it's really challenging scientifically to do it. That's why they don't do it. But there's some other barriers that emerged through my coding that I think are really, really important to think about, especially for the agencies that are involved in setting these BMPs right now. Other motivations in age. We've got a lot of retired people, so part of what happens is you get people entrenched. They've learned to be naturalists, and they're going to teach it, and you don't get the new information finding its way in. That's part of what limits the scope of what we do. In other words, many of the organizational directors spoke to the fact that the motivation for people to engage and be part of these conservation organizations was largely about being a naturalist, not about ecosystem services. It was about birds, and that they could care less about carbon. And I was trying to push at whether it was just that they couldn't care less, whichever one's correct, couldn't care less, about carbon. And I tried to push that and figure out, well, why was that? And that led to this last barrier. Ecosystem services don't have the attributes of place. And the attributes of place are what is motivating the stewardship actions and conservation actions. So this quotation is illustrative. I see carbon management as being out of my league, as a little guy working on the ground thinking about the carbon stored in these trees, as opposed to their cachet, their cooling effect. It's just a decision being made at a different scale. So time and again, I heard from these directors that they felt, all of them were local scale, single estuary conservation organizations working on the ground, that they felt that the entire discussion of carbon and carbon markets was taking place at a much bigger scale. And the reason for that is that they felt that the services that they were getting from these marshes were not the carbon services. Those are delivered at a global scale. They weren't motivated to engage with them. They were motivated by the services that they themselves were able to share and engage with as local stewards. Recreation values, right? Aesthetic values, conservation values associated with habitat of species that they cared about. Not because they cared about those species more than climate change. Every single one of them was really concerned about climate change at a global scale. But because that was their motivation for the stewardship actions at that scale. So there were organizations that did engage with the blue carbon concept, and they had two absolutely necessary, from a truth, I did a little truth table assessment, absolutely necessary conditions. And one was some sort of connection with a research laboratory, usually a university research laboratory. So this is a conservation organization, and one of the ways they overcome the technical and resource barrier is to partner with an organization that has the technical capacity and the resources. The other was a connection with a single NGO, Restore America's Estuaries, that's really actively working to promote a coastal wetlands carbon offset protocol and a lot of these pilot projects around the United States. And this networked connection with RAE, Restore America's Estuaries, I think enabled these organizations to overcome some of the concerns about the motivation, right? So they're making a decision to think at a different scale by partnering with this organization. Now, one last story from coming out of the data from these interviews. A few times we saw a really interesting pivot from greenhouse gases and carbon sequestration ecosystem services to water quality ecosystem services. And it went something like this. Organization X is interested in coastal ecosystem carbon, potentially as a source of value for dollars for restoration activities, habitat restoration activities. And so they do some research on the net ecosystem greenhouse gas budget in their marsh, and they recognize that the relative amount of dollars for restoration from that budget is likely to be pretty small. Coupled with a lack of a clear carbon market in this country, direct payment for ecosystem services was no longer pursued, and they gave up on this line. But in the process of doing this, they discovered something else. A recognition that local nitrogen pollution increases N2O emissions. So they would do this budget and find nitrous oxide emissions from their marshes. Right? And then they would start saying, hey, wait a minute, this is a reason we need to double down on the septic systems that are feeding into the marsh. Because it's not only a eutrophication problem, it's a greenhouse gas problem. And that was of keen interest to local water quality managers, who then became involved in their activities. And so what they did was re-articulate this problem from a global scale of ecosystem service delivery to a much more local scale by arguing that we needed to care about this as well. And I know that's a complicated story, but it really fits with some of the theoretical literature out there on this scale matching and mismatching and re-articulation of scales of what people care about. And we see it in this practice, in this space. So some conclusions from this paper. There's some place-based resistance to embracing ecosystem services delivered at globally diffuse scales that I found empirically through my work. There's a rearticulation from climate mitigation to water quality that helps to localize and shift scales on the issue. And I think it's really important that if we think about future top-down guidance on ecosystem services, that we incorporate or at least recognize some of the potential resistance to globally diffuse scale service sheds and focus on more local service sheds. Not because the global scale isn't important, it's incredibly important, but we need to recognize who has a stake in the ecosystem service that are being delivered by a given ecosystem and what their motivations are for engaging and not engaging. So I've basically told you a story of a concern of commodification of nature, right? And that's not a new concern. It's a concern that's been there all along throughout that Google Ngram, ramp up of ecosystem services. Every one of those conversations involved a concern about the loss of intrinsic values of nature, or of the fact that once we commodify nature, we're turning ecosystem management into an optimization problem that concerns a lot of people because they don't fundamentally see trade-offs between economic productivity and biodiversity conservation. Right? It makes people really anxious. And those concerns are all valid. It's really interesting if you read that best practices document that all of those concerns are recognized in that document. And then they say, what we're talking about is actually just a valuation problem. We recognize that there are intrinsic values, but those intrinsic values aren't involved in the valuation process. And again, that stems from some concerns around here. And so I want to nod here to the really extensive political ecology literature on the concerns over the commodification of nature. And a lot of that work has been done in other countries. A lot of that work has been done in recognition of conservation and commodification of nature as a potential form of neocolonialism. And what's fascinating, I think, about the work that I did in terms of my surprise at it is that I'm seeing resistance to commodification of nature by, very affluent Prius-driving pharmaceutical executives in California, right? And these are not people, and this is a really key point in all of this, these are not people whose livelihoods are linked to the delivery of those ecosystem services. The people I was interviewing, by and large. Maybe you could say they are if they were employed by the conservation organization, but not in the same way that people's livelihoods are linked to common pool resources in much of the theory around this, whether it's fisheries, whether it's forests. But people's livelihoods are linked to ecosystem services all over the place in new and different ways, right? When someone loses their home from a superstorm, their livelihood is implicated by the loss of ecosystem services right there, very, very dramatically, right? They're big-time stakeholders in flood mitigation ecosystem services there. So to add on to this whole story of the complexities of scale and how you get at these values and whether it's okay to use these intermediary indicators, benefit relevant indicators, is the challenge of separating ecosystem services along a new axis, an axis of how much does this affect people's livelihoods. And I think what we're looking at here is the development of a set of axes that help us co-locate in space, what or who the stakeholders in ecosystem services are. But that's all got to start by going out into the communities and engaging people around these issues. And that's challenging when the first thing you say is, do you like ecosystem services? And they say, oh no, that's a top-down framework, I don't want to talk about that. Do you have values that you want, in nature? Of course I have values, I care about this, I care about this, I care about this. And that came up in a lot of my research as well. So in addition to trying to modify the best management practices, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done to try to understand all of the complex ways that people value ecosystem services. And that probably isn't going to start by saying, what ecosystem services do you like? But payments for ecosystems services can work. So there was a study out from a couple colleagues of mine at Stanford recently where they did a fully randomized control trial of payments for ecosystem services to reduce deforestation in rural Uganda. and saw decline. There was a decline in tree cover over the 2-year span in all groups, but the treatment villages had a really significantly lower rate of decline of tree cover through these ecosystem services, using the kind of gold standard of this experimental work. So I'll leave this, and I was instructed to leave 15 minutes of time for conversation about this. So I look forward to not just having your questions about any of the details of what I've said today, but also having an open discussion about where we go next and how do we take all of what I just said and do something with it. So I hope that I at least planted a seed of interest in that space. But in conclusion, I think I would want to leave you with the idea that there's a risk of the top-down approach to the valuation process that's currently in play. That local and regional scale service sheds, especially those already operationalized within existing institutions, I think that's pretty key, will be of high importance to pay attention to. And that clarity is needed for the role of stakeholder and community engagement in the process of ecosystem service valuation steps. So the question before us is, once again, which is always the question before us, can we build new institutions with approaches to governance that are effective in navigating multiple stakeholder interests across multiple scales simultaneously? This is basically the question of sustainability, and this is just one lens through which to take a look at that question. So with that, I will take your questions.
So I want to thank Aaron, not just for a great talk, but actually leaving this time at the end. And just for people who haven't been here before, one of the things we've tried to do, you can tell he's covered a lot of ground here, and there's a lot more to be explored. In addition to the regular Q&A to look into that, one of the most exciting things I've seen happen in this room after a talk like this is the way new ideas surface, new projects emerge, new collaborations. And so I would encourage you, maybe a few people have to scoot, but this is a great chance to really plant seeds that lead to new work, new solutions, new collaborative capacity. And so
new ecosystem services.
Anyway.
Any questions? Yeah.
The discussion of service sheds struck a chord with me. When at the larger scales, one automatically turns to that the atmosphere and privacy restrictions these days. But it strikes me that that's not the only example of a global value. The one that comes to my mind are existence values.
Yep.
The way people across the world value the Serengeti system or giant pandas and such. And bringing that to the second part of your talk, where you're talking about how do you localize action. Well, one way that has been effective in that is if you can convince the people, it's not hard to convince them, you can simply inform the people who are responsible for giant pandas or Serengeti ecosystem, if they learn that there truly is global interest in what they are doing. That's time and again, that has been a significant motivation for local action, knowing the global significance of what you're trying to serve.
Exactly what you're talking about is the relationship between stakeholders in the delivery of ecosystem services and those who have a stake in the generation of those ecosystem services, right? In the origin of that service shed. And the challenge, I think, is that there are multiple and often competing interests at the same time that are putting pressure on the generators of ecosystem services, the decision makers who are in a place to control that generation. But when you walk through the Tongass National Forest in southeast Alaska, which has a huge population of grizzly bears, there's an existence value of those bears to people far away who have a stake in the old growth forest that is present there. And there are the people who have used those lands for tens of thousands of years, the Tlingit, who also have a stake, and they're the people who hunt there currently, and they're the loggers, and there's everyone else, right? It's the wicked problem. But I think if we start thinking in terms of these scales of service sheds, it's actually can, in fact, potentially become like a form of boundary spanning object, right? Where the map of the service shed and who's in and who's out and who's recognized in those services can be a unifying concept that can actually help facilitate the discussions you're talking about, which are the relationship between the generators and the delivery of the services. Any other questions? Mario?
Yeah, it's not directly related, it's where you started,
Yeah.
and kind of where you ended, in that I sort of also have two concerns in my gut about this.
Yeah.
One is that I'm not sure how these PRIs are calculated or whatever, but it seems to me it's sort of undervaluing the true nature of these things, because it sounds more like, well, this is a supply side production. But how much will you be willing to accept to maintain your land so it keeps producing these things?
Right.
Well, that seems like a little less than
Yeah.
And number two, you talk about, well, we don't want to do the social science part of it. Not that you don't want to, but the people that work in this area say, well, we don't want to do that last step.
They don't want to go out and do it. Right.
And I don't know, it was like 10 years ago, I was at the Wharton Business School at a workshop on life cycle assessment, and how you can use that in the marketplace and all that.
Yeah.
And there were all these engineers and all these biophysical scientists saying, we don't want to talk to consumers because they won't understand and it's too hard to do that. And then they would go on for an hour talking about all the gyrations they would have to do, complicated math and algorithms to come up with a CLA estimate. And when I got up there, I said, I can't believe you guys. You talk about my work is too expensive. I usually just spend 2 days talking about how big your stuff is. I don't think so.
Yeah.
I just don't see that that's a valid criticism of doing the social science part, because I really don't think that's probably where a lot of the money was spent.
Yeah. No, I absolutely think it, it does have the sort of that taste of cop-out but I think that if you go through and read it, and their goal is to get something that they can reproduce and point to and do all of that. But fundamentally, I think your concern about undervaluation is really right on. That if you're not going and actually using the methods we have to look at values that people have in these things, and there are plenty of methods out there to do that. If you're not going to that level, then you're not getting the full set of values. They do have a section where they say, well, we're getting at things that are really challenging to monetize. There are certain kinds of services that express preferences, contingent valuation, whatever, all the traditional tools we have at valuation are difficult to get at. And I do think that there's room in this space to talk about, okay, well, what makes sense as a way to get at that value best possible way we can if it's really hard. So they shy away from saying that everything needs to be put in dollar terms, and that what we really need is the full set of values in those spaghetti diagrams that we can then come up with a routine set of indicators to use. But I agree with their concerns. Josh?
You talked about this being sort of essentially a top-down approach, and so I'm sort of imagining fishermen that have maybe communicated with over the last few years and their responses to this, which I think that would be pretty negative about it. Kind of like social media, social spatial planning kind of stuff. But at the same time, if you look at marine spatial planning as an example, so if you use the solution best able to deal with it, then proactively about it. I was wondering if you could give any examples of communities taking a proactive approach to ecosystem service evaluation.
Absolutely, and maybe not these full. There's this tension here between, are you valuing particular ecosystem services that are a single service generated to a single group, or are you trying to do a full ecosystem service valuation? But a good example would be the push for living shorelines and green infrastructure. And so there's been a lot of grant work that's been made available to communities to stop armoring their shorelines, and assess and present to the community all the values that are received from doing this, and they've done these kinds of valuation methods. That's great. That's a community-driven initiative, and often the top-down force that was applied was simply making a grant call available that said, if you as a community want to do this, go do it. So the California Coastal Conservancy did that. The city of Arcata, for example, has a big initiative that's all involved with their wastewater treatment plan in Arcata Bay. It's fantastic. It's really great. I hear your concern that many people, when hearing this, their first reaction will be to balk. And maybe that's because I think there's a lot of discussions right now about the relationship between ecosystem services-based decision-making, ESBDM, and ecosystem-based management, ecosystem-based fisheries management, and ecosystem approach to fisheries management. The big push for a lot of this has come out of NOAA. And they've had a bunch of meetings recently to try to create Venn diagrams of how does this idea overlap with the challenges of ecosystem-based management. Because fundamentally, if you go back to thinking about my little example from Mary Meeting Bay, what we're talking about is ecosystem-based management. If you're looking at all of the values of an ecosystem, you're not, even if your remit under the act that's giving you the authority to make regulations is narrowly focused just on a specific species, for example, this requirement from the White House then expands the scope to the whole ecosystem in a way that has a lot of overlaps. I think that most of the space of concern about this hasn't been as much about the usurpation of decision-making and ownership of knowledge issues in fisheries. It's been about this gut reaction to commodification. And I think it's a really interesting space to think about whether some of the same reactions that have taken place to CMSP, Coastal Marine Spatial Planning, would apply as this is rolled out at a larger scale of decision making. And it'd be fun to work on that.
So I think that you talked, and we've kind of been talking a lot about organizations that already exist and maybe already exist in one place and are doing some work, and then are trying to figure out the ecosystem service valuation of that work that they're already doing. And I was reading a paper recently that was trying to look at cases, particularly with dam removals, where ecosystem service valuation has been one of the motivations for the project to take place in a certain place, and they can't really find that. And so I'm wondering if you think there's a place for a kind of wide view of where are the most ecosystem service values, and let's try to take action there. Is that too top-down of an approach? Will you not have the local buy-in then? Is it not worth even doing the valuation exercise then?
What do you think? No, I'm agnostic about it, and I mean that seriously because, I've talked with a couple of land trusts, and they said, look, we're so excited to do these ecosystem service valuations because I think we're going to discover some things that we didn't realize before. And some of I think the most exciting initiatives in this space have come from the things like that was taking place in the Watersheds in Southern Maine initiative, where a lot is learned by doing this, right? That there's a real benefit to say, hey, and I'm involved with the project right now that's looking at the full value of blue carbon ecosystems of tidal marshes in Maine. Right? And I think we're going to learn a lot from that. We're going to learn a lot about the nuances of what drives those ecosystem services. That's really exciting because that gives you these other levers to start thinking about turning, right? If you say, wait, when we do this with the best available techniques out there, we do this valuation, we've discovered that, these specific locations of ecosystems have really just like absolute, they're hotspots of ecosystem services, right? And people love hotspot maps because they locate attention and they can be then used to garner more funds to do fun things. So I actually think that the process of doing this outside of the regulatory context and in the context of initiating ideas is very, very different from the concern I have about using it as a basis for making either regulatory or other stewardship decision making. So I think there's a difference between optimizing ecosystem service value production in your stewardship mission plan and doing a big set of ecosystem service valuations to try to unlock and uncover some new interesting things.
So I have learned several important lessons here. One is next time I will only allow Aaron to talk for 5 minutes so we can have 50 minutes to
talk about. I'll